Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jane Ullman. I'm an attorney here in Israel. Good morning for those of you in the East Coast. First of all, I'd like to give you a little about myself. I'm an attorney trained in Israel, originally from California. I've lived in Israel for over 25 years, and I'm an attorney for over 20 years. I have an office in Jerusalem, specializing in real estate, small business, and wills and inheritances. I've been asked to talk to you today about renting, which is generally the first step for many Olim when they first move to Israel. And there are many differences between renting in Israel and renting in America. So I would like to address those for you today and go through what a basic rental contract looks like and the things to look out for in a contract. As opposed to America, and Canada, there are no standard leases in Israel. Therefore, any lease that's given to you is given to you by the owner of the property that you're looking at renting. And it should be reviewed by an attorney to make sure that your rights are protected and to protect you from the pitfalls that can come up in leases which are not advantageous to a renter. We're going to go through those step by step. The point of having an attorney and the point of having knowledge is to prevent you from feeling like this picture when you begin your rental process. As with all things in Aliyah, knowledge is power. And the more resources you have and the more information you have going into the process, the more you'll feel in control, be able to control your environment, be able to protect yourself, and not fall into those horror stories that a lot of Olim have. 3 basic tips for success, and this goes for both rental contracts and for purchase or sale contracts in Israel. First of all, you need to lose your expectations. It looks like things are very similar. You feel that you should understand how things should work, but it's really different. For instance, in Israel, there are no rental complexes where a whole building is available for rent. All the apartments in the building are available for rent, and you can walk into the rental office, sign a standard contract, and give your first and last month's deposit, get the keys, and walk out. Instead, each apartment or each house is individually owned and rented out by that owner. So therefore, you're not going to encounter the standardized leases that you're used to in America. Second of all, know what your resources are. An attorney is one of your most important resources, as well as an experienced agent, which will help filter out properties for you and find you properties which are suitable and not waste your time. You should always insist on understanding any contract that you're signing. Don't just sign anything because someone tells you, trust me, it's fine, and you should sign it. You need to understand the terms of the contract. And the third is to build yourself a team. Those resources often are part of your team. You need to make sure that you have people in your corner that are really looking out for you. Okay, the rental contract basics. Any contract covers the following 3 categories: business terms, maintenance and repairs, and additional costs and securities. Let's go through them one by one. Business terms. First of all, which property are you renting? What kind of property is it? Is it an apartment? Is it on the 3rd floor? Does it include the storage room? For instance, a lot of times, a landlord will include certain things and not other things. For instance, he might have a storage room that he's storing his own items in, his own belongings, and he won't include that in the lease. Does it include furnishings? Remember that apartments in Israel are rented and sold stripped. They don't generally include appliances or furniture unless it's specified in the contract. There has to be a specific list of which appliances and which pieces of furniture are included in your property. Additionally, even closets are considered outside pieces of furniture, external pieces of furniture in Israel, and it's not a given that any apartment will have closets. You need to ask and make sure it's listed in the contract. A third piece of basics is making sure that the person that you're renting from actually has the rights to the property. This seems like Aleph Bet, ABC, but you'd be surprised at the cases that we hear that you're signing a contract with the landlord's son, but he doesn't actually have a power of attorney. Obviously, if you sign a contract with someone that doesn't have the ownership rights, your contract is worthless. So you need to make sure that you ask to have the property ownership rights proven to you, shown to you before you rent. And this is a reasonable question, even if the landlord acts like it's not. An additional piece of information that you might have in your lease is whether or not any repairs will be made before you begin the lease. In general, apartments are rented as is, and they will often write that in big English letters. And that means that you can't come in and claim that you didn't know that there was a certain problem. It doesn't mean that the landlord doesn't have to repair a problem that's causing you problems and prevents a reasonable use of the property as you go along. But oftentimes, if there are repairs that you want to have done, if you don't state it in the contract before you start, the landlord will not necessarily be obligated to perform those repairs. For instance, if you want him to put in screens, or you want him to put in window bars, or you want to have a thorough cleaning of the apartment before you begin, that needs to be in your contract. The next item for the business terms is the rent. This seems obvious, but there's a lot of factors which go into it. How much is the rent? Is it paid monthly? Is it paid quarterly? Would you get a discount if you paid it in advance? Is it paid by post-dated check, automatic debit? Other ways of, other terms that come in is linkage. Israel is really fixated on something called linkage, known in Hebrew as hatzmada, which means that your price is linked to the CPI. And that's to protect against inflation. It's really left over from times of wild inflation in Israel, but a lot of times we still see it in the contract that they'll give you a rent of, say, 5,000 shekels a month linked to the index. That means the next year or in 2 years, even if you have a long lease, the rent could go up. So you need to pay attention on whether or not it's linked. And as a tenant, you're always looking to have it not be linked, which will save you money. The date of the payments. Is it paid on the 1st, on the 9th? What happens if you're late? All of those kinds of things need to come into your contract regarding the rent. The next item is the lease period. In general, leases in Israel are for 1 year to 2 years. If you can get it extended and have the option to have 3 to 5 years, that's considered a bonus, but most landlords don't like to lock themselves into more than 1 year or 2 in the beginning. Again, that goes back to the idea that there are no rental complexes in Israel. So each landlord wants to have the flexibility if he wants to sell the property that he doesn't want to be bound by a lease. So you need exact dates from this date to that date. If you have agreed with the landlord that you will have an option to extend, that needs to be specifically stated in your contract. It also needs to be your option and not a mutual option. A mutual option, a lot of times landlords like to write, both parties may agree at a later date to extend the contract if they like each other. That's not really an option because the landlord could just decide not to, or sometimes they write, we will agree to give an option, but we'll decide the rent later. That's also worthless for you as a tenant because if he comes up with a fantastically high rent, it doesn't protect your rights. What should your option look like? It needs to say, the tenant shall have the right to extend the lease for a further 2 years or 3 one-year periods each, and what the rent will be for each of those periods. That is an option which protects your rights. If you would like to have the option to get out of your lease early, that also needs to be stated, as there's no automatic early out clause in leases in Israel. There's no rent caps, which is why the rent needs to be stated for options. And there are no early out clause. There's no such a thing as if I give my landlord 3 months notice in the middle of the lease that he'll let me out, unless it states clearly in your contract that you can do so. One thing to be aware of, however, is that most times, if there's an early out clause, it's mutual, meaning that if you want the option to be able to give 2 or 3 months notice to get out of your contract, the landlord also will have that option. say he finds a buyer or he decides that he wants to let someone in his family use it. And that can put you in a precarious situation in certain neighborhoods where it's very difficult to find a rental, especially in the middle of the year. For instance, if you have children, all of a sudden in December, you need to find a rental because he gave you 3 months notice. It can put you at a disadvantage. So you have to weigh whether or not it's worth having the out clause against the danger of being thrown out of the apartment early. Subletting. This is also against most contracts unless you have it specifically stated that you're allowed to sublet. That's not the same thing as finding a replacement tenant. If you want to be let out of your contract early, oftentimes a contract will state that you are allowed to leave early if you find a replacement tenant to the landlord's satisfaction. But we're talking about people who, for instance, might be going back to the States or abroad for the summer and they'd like to be able to recoup some of that lost rent, so they'd like to sublet it out. That has to be stated specifically in the contract. And just as a rule, it's in general not something we see very often, as the landlord doesn't want to do that. Okay. About prices, we had a question now about whether, and I'm sorry, I'm getting fed questions, so every once in a while I'll stop, whether or not the renting makes it affordable. It really depends on the area in which you'd like to rent, whether or not you would consider rent affordable versus the amount that you're paying on your mortgage. One general tip is to, when you're looking to make aliyah and to decide in which neighborhood you should start renting, you should also look at the housing prices for purchasing, because you never want to rent in a place, if you have an eye on purchasing eventually, in a place that you would not be able to afford purchase. All that does is set you up for a situation where you'll have to move your family, because now you're ready to buy and you actually can't afford to buy where you're renting. One of the things that we see a lot of times is people continue to rent because they can't get the down payment together. Down payments in Israel are fairly hefty. You're usually talking a minimum of 30% down as a buyer who's already a resident of Israel. If you're buying as someone who's not yet in Israel, that's higher, 50%. But if you're buying as someone who's already a resident of Israel, you need to have 30% down. So if you can come up with that down payment, and depending on the mortgage rates, a lot of times it's worthwhile to buy. If if the mortgage payments would outpace the rent in such a way that it makes it unaffordable for you, then that either you're going to have to look for a cheaper area to live in, or you'll have to continue renting. Rental properties being plentiful, that depends on the area you're looking in. Certain areas, for instance, certain areas in Modi'in, very difficult to find rentals, and then you'll see the rent prices really rise in response to that, supply and demand. Whereas in the South, it's much easier to find a rental, and therefore you'll see rental properties be lower in general. Real estate agencies do not deal with the contracts in general. That's why people use lawyers. They can sometimes help you make sure that you have ownership rights, but what they'll do is just give you the contract, and if you want to have the contract reviewed or make sure that it's protective for you, you need to show it to a lawyer. Okay, we're moving on to the next section of our lecture. Okay, maintenance and repairs. This is an area of the contract that I spend a lot of time negotiating as an attorney, because it's the most it's the area of the contract that the most questions and the most issues arise throughout the life of a lease and as a tenant. First of all, repairs. Who is responsible for repairing which aspects of a property? They amended the law a few years ago, so therefore tenants are now in a more protective state, but it's not foolproof. In general, landlords are responsible for infrastructure repairs to the apartment, and they must also, if they'd like to have structural insurance, that's also their responsibility. They're not allowed to push that off onto a tenant, which once upon a time you saw a lot more in leases. And tenants are responsible for third-party insurance and repairs which are considered, they're called kalei erech, which are low-cost repairs, generally things that you can do yourself. or things which are caused through your own negligence. Something that we see often, for instance, people that use flushable wipes or things like that, and they clog up a toilet. That's considered negligence, and that repair would be on the tenant. However, if a pipe just bursts, generally, as it happens sometimes in properties, that would be the responsibility of the landlord. Now, one thing that happens is that the standard contract will state that as a tenant, you are required to return the property in the same condition in which you received it, minus normal wear and tear. So one very, very important piece of your puzzle, and a very big piece of advice that I give all of my clients, is that I put into every contract that when the tenant receives his keys or her keys, you will do a walkthrough and write down any defects which you see in the apartment. That doesn't mean necessarily that the landlord has to fix it, but it sets a baseline. Because 4 or 5 years afterwards, and the landlord comes back to take possession of the apartment, there's a crack in the countertop, or a door is missing, or a window is broken. And you'll say, but it was like that when I got the keys. If you don't have anything written down, and there's no baseline to which to compare it to, it's really your word against theirs. And so it's very protective. If you walk through, take pictures, write it down, say, this is how we got it, and then there won't be any argument when you give the apartment back. What is considered normal wear and tear? That's also kind of a gray area. And as much as they've tried to amend the law, there are a lot of gray areas. And normal wear and tear generally consists of, banged up paint, or, a small leak underneath the sink, things like that. If your child had a fit of anger and stuck his fist through the door, then that's obviously not normal wear and tear. So you need to return the apartment in the same condition in which you received it, minus normal wear and tear. Now, there are a few repairs which really become gray area. According to the law, the landlord is meant to fix things which prevent reasonable use. Now, in Israel, we don't have the same type of mold problems that they have in America, but they do have certain types of condensation mold, or what's known as retivut, which is dampness. And that can cause problems. And what you need to do is go on record as soon as possible to tell the landlord that you see the problem in writing. And you also have to allow the landlord to come in and fix the problem. One thing to go back to, if when you're doing a walkthrough at the beginning of an apartment and you see mold and dampness, my advice is to not rent that apartment. Mold and dampness are notoriously hard to locate and to repair. And renting the apartment on the assumption that a landlord will be able to fix it, if it's a severe problem already, is not a good idea. Okay, one area of repairs which also needs to be specifically stated in the contract is regards to appliances and air conditioning. Air conditioning, again, is not necessarily considered one of the built-in systems of a house, and it needs to be stated whether or not the air conditionings are considered part and parcel of the apartment. And also, if the apartment is being rented to you with appliances such as an oven or a washing machine, and the oven or the washing machine breaks down, who pays for that repair? That is generally a point of negotiation and something that needs to be addressed in your contract. Okay, maintenance. Oh, I'm going to stop for a question along the way. 1 second. When should we rent in relation to our aliyah and lift arrival? Okay, you definitely want to, most rentals, the question is, when should we rent in relation to our aliyah and lift arrival? Most rentals will be available within 2 months of when they're being advertised. In general, if something comes up in May, they're not going to wait for you until August 20th. So in general, you either need to have someone with intel on the ground, an agent which knows of a place coming up maybe a month before you're coming, or you'll have to build into your aliyah budget to rent a few extra, an extra couple of months in order to make sure that you have a place. I also have people that can help you set up your apartment. There are concierge services that can go in, make sure it's clean, make sure you have basic amenities. But obviously, there's usually a gap between when you arrive and when your lift arrives. So you'll need to borrow, basic furniture or rent somewhere that's furnished. Okay, is it possible or advisable to have a relative represent or actually rent an apartment before you arrive? Yes. A lot of times people have a friend or a relative arrange the rental and they take videos, or maybe you've come on a pilot trip because one important piece of this puzzle, which we're going to get to when we get to payments, is how do you arrange the payments before you've actually made aliyah? So I'll give you a few ideas when we get to the next slide. And someone can come and they can come take the keys for you and make sure that you have it already arranged before you come. Okay, one other question. I'm going to go back to my lecture. Oh, I think those are, oh, here's my last question. Okay, the cost for renting an attorney, I'll get to it at the end. It's usually between half a month's rent and a month's rent. On one of my slides is cost, so hang on with me and we'll get to the costs. Okay, more on maintenance issues. A few other things to pay attention that need to be addressed in your contract is garden maintenance. If you have a garden, sometimes they'll ask you to make sure that you pay the garden maintenance. Insurance, again, you should be looking just to protect yourself, to have third-party insurance. And if you have any of your contents, you can do your own contents insurance. And landlord's visits regarding whether or not he can come in and check that you're doing maintenance. We would want to make sure in your contract that it states that he can only come when you're there, and he has to give you at least advance notice of 24 to 48 hours. That protects your privacy, and also he won't just knock on your door one evening in the middle of dinner. Okay, vacating. What happens when you have to give the apartment back? You do a second walkthrough, and then again, that's why it's helpful to have the first baseline to make sure that any problems that would come up, oh, the place is not clean enough, and you would show a picture showing that it's actually cleaner than when you got it. Whether or not you have to paint, that has to go into your contract also, by the way, whether or not you have to paint at the end of your lease. The standard is that you have to paint. Sometimes you can get it that it's only painting as needed or patching up certain areas. If you've hung things on the wall, you must patch the holes and paint those areas. And whether or not you have to have it cleaned. Is it just broom swept, or do you have to have it professionally cleaned? Those things generally mirror whatever happened when you got it. If you got it professionally cleaned and painted, you can expect to have to give it back in the same state. Next slide. Additional costs. Okay. In general in Israel, the tenant pays all the usage costs connected with the apartment, including the property tax, which is known as arnona. Arnona goes according to the status of the person who's renting or using the apartment, and not according to the person who owns the apartment. You will have a discount on your arnona as an ole for the first 100 meters of an apartment for 12 months within the first 2 years of your aliyah. There are also other discounts based on income or if you're a senior citizen. But in general, the arnona is paid by the tenant. So you pay the utilities, you see it on the slide here, the utilities, water, gas, electric. The vad bayit, if you're living in any sort of apartment building, there's generally vad bayit or a management fee that's like a communal organization which pays to clean the stairwells and the elevator insurance, elevator maintenance, those kinds of things. You have to ask whether or not there's a vad bayit. If you're in a more high-end or newer apartment building, often there's a management company and they take care of all of those things, especially if there are facilities like a gym or a pool or something like that. You'll see a management fee. So you need to ask, in addition to the rent, what are the management fees or the vad bayit fees? Arnona, as I mentioned, with the property tax, you need to ask how much is the arnona for that property, and whether or not you're required to have a gardener maintain the property. Sometimes we also relate in the contract what happens if all of a sudden we have an ant problem or it needs to be exterminated. You can ask again, are they exterminating before you move in? Then you would be required to continue on with that. And if they are not, then you can usually ask the landlord to do an extermination. That's another one of those gray areas, so it's important to try to relate to it in your contract to avoid questions. Insurance, I mentioned it a little bit before. In general, the rule is that the landlord has to cover structural insurance for the property, and the tenant covers third party and fire and contents if you wish. I suggest it because anything that's coming on your lift is usually worth a lot of money, and it's worth doing contents insurance. Things to pay attention to when your lease is ending: the cost of painting, cost of cleaning, and any repairs that you would need to fix in order to give back the apartment in the same condition in which you received it. Okay, securities. This is the second most labor-intensive aspect of any contract, which is what kind of securities are you required to give as a tenant? It's important to understand the background to the issue of securities in Israel. The law mostly favors the tenant with regards to possession. It's very difficult to evict a delinquent tenant in Israel. For that reason, the securities which a landlord is allowed to ask and even advised to require are much higher than you would see in North America. It's not just first and last month's rent. Instead, what they're trying to do is cover an exposure of 6 months of unpaid rent, which is generally the amount of time it would take to evict a delinquent tenant through a court process, plus the exposure to damage to their apartment and unpaid bills. So therefore, you see a few options, and generally landlords will ask for a combination of 2 or even 3 of these types of securities. So what are the options? The first is a guarantor. This is very foreign to North American Ullman, that you would have to ask someone else to sign as your guarantor on your apartment. I'm an upstanding citizen, I've rented apartments for 50 years, I have a job, I have this much money in my bank account. They don't care. They just want to expand the net of who would be responsible in the event that you move back, don't pay your bills, don't move out. So they're oftentimes looking for a guarantor. It has to be an Israeli citizen, over 18, and a lot of times they'll ask even to see a payments, pay stub, their salary slips, to make sure that they actually have a solid job. Most of the time they ask for 2. My initial inclination is always to try to negotiate down to 1. We also try to negotiate it that it would be a limited guarantor, meaning that they're not a blanket guarantor for every obligation that you have under the lease, but limited up to 20,000 shekels, 30,000 shekel, things like that. It's important also to note that your guarantor will also be your guarantor for any option periods should you negotiate those into your contract. Okay. I have a question called, is Demei Mafteach still in place? Demei Mafteach is left over from when there was protected housing and protected tenancy. The theory is still in place, but every single rental contract in Israel has several paragraphs which state that there is no key money, no Demei Mafteach, and therefore you would not be a protected tenant. So the idea is in place, but in practice it's not used. Okay. Okay, if there's no contract and the landlord has only verbally agreed to have you as a tenant, does Israeli law favor the tenants or the owners? Israeli law would view that as what's called agreement by behavior, haskama behitnagut, and that can be considered a binding contract, especially if you continue to pay the rent and they continue to take it. It gets dicey and gray when you didn't already have a first contract. Meaning if you had a first contract that was for a year or 3 years, and then after 3 years, everyone just became very loose and you continued to go on with the same arrangement without a lease. In general, the law will view that as though you had continued the terms of the first contract and go year by year. If you moved in without any sort of contract, you would have more of a case to say that it was month by month. And that's not protective for anyone and basically just a big opening for a legal dispute. So always try to have some sort of written agreement, even if at the very minimum you're talking WhatsApp or anything like that rather than just a phone call. Okay, I'm going to move on to the rest of my securities. I'll go back to some other questions. The second type of security that we see often in Israel are checks. In Israel, it is illegal to cancel a check. So you can't just cancel a check and c'est la vie, that's the end of it. What happens is that they can put a check into a special collections court called Hotzat La'Po'al and collect on that check. So one of the things that often you'll see is that they want the rent paid with post-dated checks. First of all, it's a pain. And people don't even use checks anymore so much, but we see it a lot because it forms a type of security for the landlord, because if you don't pay the rent on time, they can just continue to put those checks in for collection. So be prepared that they will ask you for post-dated checks and you need to order checks. Often we also see open utility checks, meaning a check without a date and without an amount of money made out to the electrical company, to the municipality for the property tax, the arnona, things like that. And they hold those, and then if there's an unpaid bill at the end, which you don't take care of, they can fill in the date, fill in the amount, and pay off your bill. So one thing happens with a lien is that you're supposed to give these post-dated checks, and you don't have any checks because you haven't come here to open an account. One solution is that you have a friend or a relative put the checks up for you with an agreement in the contract that within 3 months of when your rent starts, your lease starts, you can swap those checks out for your own checks once you've opened an account and gotten your own checks. Another option is that the landlord will allow you to give kind of a bulk sum of the first 4 months or something like that, and that you can give the checks by date X of the lease. Those are a couple of the ways that we get around the issue of people who need to give post-dated checks when they haven't been here to get any checks yet. And the rest of the security options relate to a deposit. In addition to having a guarantor, a landlord will want some sort of monetary deposit, and this can take a few forms. One is a bank guarantee. This is like a CD that the money has to be locked up in your account for the benefit of the landlord. You go to the bank, you give them the lease and the landlord's details and the dates, and they give you out a piece of paper which states that they've locked up this amount of money for the benefit of the landlord, and he holds this piece of paper. The advantage of that, of the bank guarantee, is that the money, when it expires, reverts back into your account, and you don't have to chase the landlord in order to get the money back and hope that he hasn't, used it on a vacation to Jamaica. The disadvantage is that you have to put the money up and it's locked up in your account and you can't use it. The law has now limited any sort of cash deposit, either cash or a bank guarantee, to 3 months rent, and that's the maximum that they can ask for in cash deposit. It doesn't limit them from asking for other things, such as a security check, which isn't cashed, or what's known as a shtar chov, which is the last thing on that list, known as a promissory note. It's kind of a big piece of paper, and it also can be taken to the collections court if you default or have unpaid bills. And a lot of the reason why people use the shtar chov is because it has a place that also your guarantor can sign. Unlike a check, which is only you, the shtar chov also allows for a guarantor to sign on it. So if you're going to ask me to rank the securities which are the best for tenants, you're trying to at least give the securities which you don't have to put up the cash for. So the security check, shtar chov, and then either a cash deposit or a bank guarantee. But the cash deposit or the bank guarantee are limited to 3 months rent for a year of the lease, 3 months of a year of the lease. So you might often see that they're going to ask you for more than one form. So you can be expecting to see a shtar chov for X amount plus 2 months rent or something like that, because they're often looking to have some sort of liquid cash in case there was a small repair or a small bill left open. Okay, now going on, legal recourse. Okay, what happens if things don't go as planned? In general, the law relates to a lot of these issues. It's not foolproof, and I would have to admit that a lot of times tenants are at a disadvantage when landlords don't act the way that they're supposed to, but the law has come a long way in order to set forth who is supposed to do what regarding rentals. Defects which prevent reasonable use are something that the landlord must repair according to the law. If he does not, you are allowed to reduce the rent with a proportionate amount of the reduction in value for the period that it takes him to perform those repairs following a reasonable amount of time. If the property gets sold by the landlord, that does not deter from your lease, again, unless the landlord has an out clause and he can chuck you out with 2 or 3 months notice. If there's no such clause in your lease, then if the landlord sells the property while you have a valid lease, the new owner must honor the lease and your rights are protected. And the tenant also has a right to have his deposit returned. It's important to write in the lease within how much time, 30 days, 60 days, as soon as you show that all the bills are repaired. That's an important piece that also needs to be related to in your contract to make sure that your rights are protected and you get your money back. The landlord's rights. The landlord can have a claim against a tenant for late payment, non-payment, damage, not moving out. You will see in the lease that over 7 days delay in making a payment will be considered fundamental breach, at which time they're allowed to cancel the contract and start eviction proceedings. That would also, we would want to elongate that period and try to put 14 days before they can cancel your contract, because things happen in the world, and try to give you more time to cure any breach that they see. A lot of times we'll see illegal clauses in these leases. For instance, eviction without due process. You'll see clauses that if someone's late on their lease by 7 days, they can come in, chuck out your stuff, change the locks, and throw you out of the house. That is illegal in Israel. They have to go through due process, and they're not allowed to do that. So either you can put in your lease, subject to all relevant law, which nullifies the clause, or you should have the clause removed entirely from your lease. They're also not allowed to use the deposit unless they give you advance notice. So it's important to write, even so, in your lease that they first have to notify you of the fact that they think you're in breach and give you the opportunity to cure the breach. And the other thing that we still see, in spite of the fact that the law limits cash deposits to 3 months, that they will still ask you for 6, 7, 8 months of cash deposits. And sometimes people don't know the difference and they'll give it. So know your rights, that you do not have to give up more than 3 months cash, 3 months equivalent rent in cash. Okay, let's see. I'm going to continue on and then I'll go to these last questions. Okay. I don't see on the addition, I'm going to go back to additional costs because I don't see that I had listed here the cost for an agent and the cost for an attorney. An attorney is generally half a month to a month's rent plus VAT. VAT is value added tax, and it's 17%, which you pay on all services in Israel. Our office takes a half a month's rent. And an agent generally take 1 month's rent plus VAT. And the other additional costs that you'll have, again, is cleaning and painting and those kinds of things. So those are the costs for an attorney and an agent. I have a question here. Real estate prices are dropping in the US. Is the same in Israel? Well, up until last week, I would have said no. And right now, I'm not sure. I think that we will see a certain stagnation. But again, all real estate prices worldwide are a function of a few things. One is supply and demand, and Israel's demand outweighs its supply, which is one of the reasons why you see prices stay stable. And the other is that we have a very strong lending market because our lending policies are very conservative, so you don't see a lot of mortgages underwater. People don't default on their mortgages because they already have quite an amount of equity in the house from the get-go, because they're required to put down at least 30%. And more than that, Israel has a sentimental value as well as a Jewish culture of home ownership. And those are things that keep the demand high for housing in Israel. I will say that I haven't seen a huge rise in the last year, but I haven't really seen a come down in prices. Okay, so I'm going to open up for more questions. Okay. Here we go. How does a new Ole find guarantors? That's an excellent question and a big problem. A lot of times, Ullman don't have guarantors, and at that point, your option is to offer a higher cash deposit, because you're trying, again, to balance between the various options. Let's go back to those. You're trying to balance between the options of the securities. So if you're like, listen, I don't know anyone in the country, certainly not anyone that I'm comfortable enough to ask to sign on my lease, so I will pay 3 months in advance. I'll give you 3 months cash deposit plus a shtarcho for X. You have to negotiate a little bit. It's not an easy thing, and you're looking for someone that's going to be a little flexible with you. I will say in general, as a piece of overall advice, that your landlord, the relationship with your landlord has a chemistry to it. And however your landlord is acting within the framework at the time of the negotiations for the lease is the landlord on his best behavior. And if you're getting a bad feeling, he's not going to be any better as a landlord, and I would look for something else. So follow your gut instinct. That's more important than anything else I could have talked about. Oh, I have a lot of questions. I better start answering. Okay. Will we need a guarantor even if we can show assets on a bank account? They don't do credit checks in Israel, so they're not actually interested on whether or not you have assets in a bank account. They're more interested in how easy it's going to be for them as a landlord to recoup the loss of you not paying rent or you not moving out in time or you causing damage. So if you don't have a guarantor, the better thing to do is offer a better deposit or pay more rent in advance. Do I have a recommended contract template? No, we do contracts that individually for each case. I don't have a contract template, and I negotiate each contract individually. Obviously, there are some things that are the same for every contract, but each contract is negotiated specifically on the terms of that deal. Can you use checks from your original country? No. They're really not enforceable. An American check takes at least 30, if not 60 days to clear in Israel. So it's really useless for a landlord. And what you can do is wire to his account the first couple months of rent, and that will give him a little bit of security and allow him to hold the property, you know, and let you start the process of making aliyah and getting the checks once you come. Okay. Hebrew term for subletting, that would be called schirut mishneh, like secondary leasing. So you're looking for a socher mishneh or being allowed to do schirut mishneh. Okay. How common are short-term furnished rentals? Those are pretty common, and I have a few property managers, if you want to be in touch with me, that specialize in those. I'm looking to see if they put my information up here, but I don't think they did. Let's see. Okay, I don't know why Mike, Nata, can you write my email there on the chat? Yeah. Okay, so my email is Jane, Jane, at rolaw.co.il, and my cell phone is 054-6606-132. So anyone that has any questions that we're not going to get to tonight, please feel free to either send me an email or even WhatsApp me, and I'll try to answer your questions. And if you need to find a furnished short-term rental, I can also help you on that. Any other? Two more? Two more, and then then I'll ask you. Yeah, two more, and then that's it. Okay. Can you pay a security deposit by credit card? Not generally, unless the landlord somehow has the ability to pay by credit card, but generally not. But we do use wire transfer in Israel very commonly, so that's what you would be looking to do. My contact info. Oh, there you go. There it is. I'm sorry that should have been on the first slide, but this has all kind of come together. Generally, I have a flyer when we're sitting in a lecture, so I guess that just didn't give out. Anyone that wants to email me, I'm happy to send you the flyer that I prepare for this lecture, and then you would have all the information at your fingertips. Okay.
We have two questions here. Yeah. How do you verify if an agent or landlord actually owns or represents the apartment? I know of a case the Ullman lost money for deposit.
Okay, so a landlord, they can be required, I discussed that in the very beginning. A landlord, you can ask to see the title abstract and show that it's the same person. An agent, again, the agent's not signing the lease for you, the landlord is. And if the agent has the keys, they generally are representing you. There is an agent's database to make sure that they're a licensed agent. So that's also verifiable. But regarding the landlord, you want to make sure that they have ownership rights. And you would ask, please show me the ownership rights of the apartment.
Do you still pay an agent or lawyer's fee if deal falls through?
No, generally you don't pay an agent or lawyer's fee if the deal falls through. Agents for sure not. The lawyers, it depends if it's, you know, the second or third one and you've just decided you're never making aliyah and you're not going to do a deal, then oftentimes they'll come to an arrangement to compensate for time. But no, in general, we don't take for the first failed contract.
Okay, there are two more questions here. What's the best way to prove timely payment of rent? What if the landlord wants you out and holds off on cashing your check to claim late payment?
So I've never had that happen. What you can do if they haven't cashed your check, then again, it would be, you could obviously bring bank statements and show that you had the money in your account. In all contracts in Israel have a basis of good faith, and everyone is obligated to act on good faith. Otherwise it's considered breach of contract. So if your landlord would do something like not cash a check in order to try to claim that you hadn't paid on time, then that would be a breach of good faith.
I had one more question here. Sounds pretty specific. I'll tell them to contact you.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and we hope to see you home soon here in Israel.